أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin as always in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Assalamu alaikum to my Muslim listeners and viewers. And I also want to thank a number of people who have made the decision to subscribe. It feels good. So hopefully I will be able to provide services that will be of benefit to you and to the Ummah at large and to all of humanity on this planet Earth. So in my work, I always talk about Islam as a construct. In fact, all religions are a construct. And I want to talk about that for a little while because the construction is something that takes part on the place of human beings and therefore, as history has shown us, can be reconstructed over time. Sometimes this reconstruction is intentional, and sometimes it's just a consequence of responding to realities that occur in our lives. This is important because in Islam there are what we consider to be primary sources, and even the designation of primary is a construct. And so I want to talk about the delicate relationship between how these primary sources have been used, interpreted, put into application, reused, made into new applications over time. It's important to think about it because I believe that Islam is a partnership between that which we consider to be our creator and to which we will return, Allah in Arabic, or God. And yet there would be no Islam if there were not people. So when the primary sources were provided for us by the mercy and generosity of our Creator, for example, revelation, in the context of Islam, then that means the Quran. We believe that the source of it is divine, that Allah is the original point for this experience of revelation. And that revelation came to our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or upon him be peace. And we also believe, therefore, that his example, that is what we call sunnah, or normative behavior, and his statements, hadith, plural ahadith, are in fact divinely inspired. So if you have these two divine sources and everybody more or less agrees that these are the sources of what we consider to be Islam, then where's this human construction that I'm talking about? So, for example, in my area of expertise, which is the Quran, we have over 6,000 verses. And in these verses, there are some statements that are very explicit, but overwhelmingly, most of the statements in the Quran are about life, a little bit about history, about nature, about the human being itself, the strives for goodness in our lives, the efforts to be able to violate that goodness intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, therefore, to create harm and destruction. We consider this to be a sin. But who is the we? And how do we consider something to be either good or bad? We are not just taking a statement from the Quran verbatim saying this is good and then determine the full purview of what is good or the means for application or what to do in cases of exception with regard to it. Instead, we're having a dynamic, intellectual, spiritual, and practical interaction with these statements in order to be able to allow for the full gist of what it means to be able to establish the good. So over time, the first 200 or 300 years of Islam and Islamic thought, The primary architects of the construction of what is Islam were the jurists. And the jurists had a very specific task, and that is once we believe, and we do believe, once we believe that the revelation, the Quran, and the Sunnah, that is the practices of the Prophet, are both explicit exemplaries of what is good and what is just and what is necessary in order to lead a decent life as a human being, we find that we have to establish checks and balances about how these are pragmatically adjudicated in the life of those people who want to follow the goodness and the beauty. So human beings interact with these sources, which I tend to refer to as the primary sources. That is, we interact with statements in the Quran, with statements made by the Prophet, with our view of the Prophet's behavior, which now only comes to us as a historical record. We interact with these, and we must look at all times at how to be able to actually implement them in the context of real people, real communities, real families, and in our present time, in the context of the nation state. And that means that it is the human interaction with the divine sources that becomes the means for being able to understand, therefore to implement what we consider to be good. And this was the task of the jurist. They were clear that Islam is what we call deen, that it is a way of life. But life is full of all kinds of unexpected things and emergencies and natural disasters and also amazing sort of ecological consequences of being on the planet Earth. And that means that life itself is not stable or fixed. Instead, it is dynamic and ever-changing. So how do we take the primary sources and then relate them to real people? Now, my favorite example, of course, is dealing with women, because that's the area in which I've spent so much of my intellectual, spiritual, and moral trajectory. So the Quran leads us to believe that women are fully human beings, and therefore they have full responsibility, for example, with the establishment of the ritual behaviors, with regard to implementing and sustaining what is good. And they are also the recipients of being members of a community with not just other women, and not with women who totally agree with them on everything. So we have to decide between what is given to us in the primary sources and how those sources can be used as instruments of good for all people. However, our intellectual legacy did not give the same amount of attention to women as agents of their own destiny. Instead, women were seen as appendages, either to men, in terms of sexual partnership within the halal means, or to family, that is, to their children and to their communities made up of families. Eventually, we notice that although there is this mandate for women's full humanity, that women did not represent themselves as agents at every level in which there might be an adjudication in the context of laws and policies within the community and eventually in the nation state. So part of what we're doing, for example, at Musawa, is to grapple with the ways in which the primary sources have been used to continually privilege men and to become active in the construction of Islam, to take agency with regard to how we believe we are supposed to be Muslims and how it is that we can continue to promote the good in the larger sense. So over the course of subsequent videos, I'm going to talk in more detail about some of the specifics of this For example, I'm trying to figure out how to do Islamic feminism in 10 minutes or less. But look for more comments with regard to it. And also, if you have specific questions that you would like for me to address, please feel free to add something in the comment section. Thanks. Assalamu alaikum.